So we're here in BlackMill Woods, which is the wood that I used for my project on Mametz Wood. We're surrounded by sessile oak woodland. The trees are twisted. They're almost like dancing people. The ground is covered with fallen tree trunks. There are eyes staring at us, and there are faces all around us. It's an inspiring place for me.
I would tend to agree with you, Rob. And so the project itself, inspired by David Jones as well, poet. Tell us a little about the way he inspired this work as well.
Well, for me, I think it's important that I find the human element within the landscape. And one of the ways I almost sort of force myself into finding that relationship is through interpreting the words of poets, artists, writers, songwriters, whatever. The project didn't just happen. I didn't just walk into this wood and go, great, there's some tree stumps that look a bit like faces, and if I photograph them in a certain way, I can make it look like something that happened in the First World War. It just wasn't that simple. I first came here, I didn't really know what I was doing. I was playing around with a few ideas, and some of the images I'd made reminded me of a former project I'd worked on, which was around Owen Shear's book of poems, Skirrid Hill, and he had a poem on Mametz Wood within that. Mametz Wood is a battle that's also followed him, incidentally. He's gone on to write quite a lot of drama which is related to post-traumatic stress and the way war affects people. And it's an interest of mine as well. So, yeah, the ideas really developed over time. So I'd been working here for about 3 months before I actually discovered, in parenthesis, I started doing a bit of research online about Mametz Wood. And it's a very long narrative poem, in a very sort of modernist style, but there's a lot of mythology and surrealism, and it's not too descriptive, so I don't really want to be an illustrator. I want the process to be two-way, so that I'm interpreting as well. That's, for me, what makes me an artist, and not, if you forgive the term, a photographer or an illustrator. So it started to build from there, really. And the more I knew about Mametz Wood and reading in parenthesis, and the ideas started to develop.
Did you read any, are they war diaries of that period from that particular battle?
No. There's a number of works in poetry and art which actually relate to Mametz Wood. There were a lot of artists and poets there. It was actually known as the Artists or the Poets Regiment, the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. So people like Siegfried Sassoon and Robert Graves and David Jones and Christopher, I've forgotten his name, he's an artist, was here. Well, it was there. See, I already believe I'm there. But so there's plenty of work to be going on within the artistic sphere.
Were you ever tempted in the process to go to the actual wood?
Yeah, I was. Practically it hasn't ever happened, but I probably still will. But it won't look at all like this.
No.
That's actually sort of one of the important things to me. I mean, it was bombed to pieces. So there'll be some, 100-year-old trees. Where we're standing at the moment is sort of my idea of how Mametz Wood might have looked at the time of the battle, rather than you know, after being completely flattened by an industrialised war several times over.
Are your photographs anti-war?
Yes, well, I don't try and make it explicit. I mean, I certainly am anti-war. I'm sure, you know, most people would describe themselves as anti-war. I leave it for the viewer to make up their own mind, I think, I hope. And I think that's important to me. I don't think it's the job of the artist to preach, but to guide.
Yes. Because some of that work is really, what can I say, disturbing.
Yeah. It surprised me how disturbing it became at times, actually.
It's kind of empty eye sockets, and which made the work stand out for me. And once you add that title to it, it becomes alive.
Yeah. I didn't really go into it with the idea of trying to make it particularly disturbing, but it happened, and you start to develop sort of patterns in your work because you're looking for connections. So the eye sockets or the circles and the stars
and the twisted nature
and
of
the twisted nature of it,
yeah,
all became like motifs. So you start to work following that path, and that's really quite important. In that, the images then create a greater whole being seen as a series than just the individual image, and people will see that connection.
Is that? Do you
but
think?
I mean, there's no getting away from it. You know, 4,000 Royal Welsh Fusiliers, and although nobody seems to have written it down in any of the English literature about Mametz Wood, I assume an equal number of Germans died. You know, at the same time, and you know, it wasn't a war that was about right and wrong. It was a war really. It was about colonialism. It was two great colonial forces, or three great colonial forces, fighting against each other. And you know, so the soldiers, to me, on either side of the battle, were as much victims of their governments.
Do you think that the way you've seen it and the way you've photographed it and the way you've worked it and thought about it, do you think it has more effect when you see pictures? I mean, we've all seen pictures of stills of World War I and the bodies and what have you. Do you think yours has more resonance and is more has more impact than seeing the reality of it?
Well, I think one of the problems with the reality is you don't want to look at it.
No.
You recoil from it instinctively. And I think, and it was as much something I found within David Jones' work that I wanted to sort of root out from that darkness an element of hope. You know, societies do survive wars and come out the other side, and you know, they may have suffered greatly during the time of the war, but if they're lucky, they'll flourish during times of peace. And you know, you have to celebrate that, because that's humanity. We are strong as societies.
Yeah. It's funny that when you talk about poets, because when Hedd Wyn died, of course, they draped his chair, because he won the chair at the Eisteddfod. They draped it in black. And I kind of think you kind of draped... black is such a... There's a negativity about black.
Yeah, and you know, if you're a poet or an artist, you can achieve a sort of immortality. That's not the reason I'm doing this, but you know, it's a very dead end, isn't it, the black?
Absolutely. Post-production, important part of the Mametz Wood project.
Yeah.
How do you go about it?
Well, one of the things that interested me when I initially started coming here was maybe returning to film, and I was actually quite interested in one of the sort of attributes of film is, well, let me start that again. One of the ways you can use film is double exposures, and actually I decided in the end to go with digital because it allowed me the freedom to create the double exposures in post-production. That sort of gave me the time to think about it as much as anything else, because you need to decide or find a way of making the two exposures actually relate to each other. So sometimes they almost create a completely new image, or sometimes the two layers add meaning to each other.
Was there a sort of seminal moment when you were post-producing and that you discovered the key to unlock this project?
I think there were probably several, because it kept developing, quite frankly. I kept finding different ways of doing it, ways of enhancing it, but it was that thrill of that realization when two images came together, that they created something almost completely new, and that was fantastic, it really was.
And you say there was you were just continually discovering new things, but you were processing an awful lot of imagery. Did you ever get frustrated with the project? Did it sort of get under your skin and thought, I really don't know what I'm doing with this, I want to take a big step back from it? Were there moments like that?
No, there were moments when I wasn't getting what I hoped for, and that certainly was very frustrating. If you've processed, 20 images and come out of it and there's really nothing very interesting about them, then that can be really quite painful. But you just have to keep pushing on. But it's part of the process, really. It's important to self-edit. It really is. And as I said before, I took thousands upon thousands of images over that 18 months period. Every time I visited here, I'd probably make 50 individual exposures, something along those lines. And they weren't all different compositions. Sometimes they would just be a different angle or a different depth of field or something of that ilk. But so there's a lot of images.
Something you probably couldn't have done if you were doing it on film.
No, absolutely, and that was sort of my key choice, I suppose, for going for digital. I mean, the cost would have been enormous apart from anything else, but I already had the digital cameras anyway, so it didn't really cost me anything more other than time.
So is digital photography allowing photographers to be more expressive, more artistic in what they do?
Well, it has the potential to. Whether it is or not, I don't know. I mean, as a generality, I suspect most people don't really think about photography in the artistic sense. Most people use it as a form of depiction. They're not really that interested, or they don't think of it as something that they can use to create metaphors or ideas or imagination.
I find conceptual work sometimes difficult.
Mm-hmm.
I find some conceptual work bizarre.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't find yours either difficult or bizarre. They kind of leapt off the screen, and I'm looking forward to seeing them in the flesh. Tone is important in photography, especially with black and white photography. How important was tone when you were post-producing?
It was probably the thing I struggled with most, if I'm honest. I wanted the darkness. Double exposures tend to create quite contrasty images. So actually finding a way of doing that was quite difficult. I had presets latterly set up in Silver Effects, which gave me a starting point, but actually it's not necessarily the whole answer. It still needed tweaking constantly to find a way to make those images come through. But conceptual work is only as good as the concept. I mean, one of the definitions of conceptual work is that the idea is more important than the product, assuming there is a product. But for me, I think it's actually important that the idea runs through to the finished product. I put a lot of work into developing my concepts. It took me 3 months before I even knew what I was doing here. And then, over the 18 months, the ideas continually developed.
Okay. So, but it's the work of a poet, which was inspirational, which... do you think those outside influences... Do you think the Mametz Wood would have come if you hadn't read David Jones's work?
No, absolutely not. I wouldn't have related to it in that manner. And going back to what I said earlier, it's about finding the human within the landscape that's important to me. And David Jones's work is obviously a very specific part of humanity. It's about war, it's about death, and it's about mysticism and surrealism. And so it gave me a whole scope of ways of interpreting it, ways of thinking about it. And I always try and work from words, because words actually have an inherent meaning which you can then try and reinterpret. It's important to me to find that human element, to find that way of relating to the landscape, which is not something that happens very naturally, really.
No.
I'm not as I said before, I'm not a landscape photographer because I'm a geek about geology or I'm a geek about trees. I'm a landscape photographer because I see it through the eye of a human being.
Yes. It's interesting that you talk about that, because I've got a whole series which I haven't really shown a lot of, and I did a lot of pinhole stuff where I grew up, which is in North Pembrokeshire, near Strumblehead. I was a child of, I left there when I was 7, but I used to wander, and I used to wander up the hill there, and there's Garn Fawr, which is a really special place for me. But it's looking, and pinhole gave me that sort of, veneer of softness, because that's the way I look at the place. I kind of look at it still through the eyes of a 7-year-old boy, and I don't know, but it's interaction with the place. The place is really, really important to me. Are there other places, such as the wood we're standing in now, are there other places which are really special for you and you think that maybe other projects might come from?
Yeah, I think places have to be special to me to make me want to spend the amount of time I'm going to spend in them photographing them, because the projects can go on for months or years, but also it's about relating to them. So where do the ideas come from? What are you trying to say with your photography? I think the one thing people sort of neglect almost in sort of the popular incarnation of photography is that you can say something with it.
Yes. And
to me, a photograph that doesn't say something, no matter how ambiguous or vague, really is actually very dissatisfying. It's ignoring the fact that I'm not that the viewer isn't just a sort of set of eyes with emotions attached.
Right, okay. So how important is it for you to get your message out there about your photography? I mean, you blog a lot now, and you write very coherently about yourself as a photographer.
Yeah.
So getting out there and explaining, do you think we're missing something as photographers then, that we have to explain our art?
I hope the art itself sort of speaks, I hope the art speaks for itself.
Okay.
But I can't really speak for other photographers, and I hope I don't criticise other photographers too much, but for me, I feel like I've made a discovery about the way I work, which is important to me, and I'm more than happy to try and share that. And I realise that for most of the photographic world, it looks like complete nonsense.
Are you doing yourself a disservice, Rob? Because people's reaction to your work, especially on Twitter, because I'm a great Twitterer and I follow you, the reaction to your work has been, on the whole, if not exclusively, good.
Yeah, though it's interesting now that I'm actually doing more conventional landscapes. I'm noticing now that things don't just get retweeted by my friends, but then when people who have no idea who I am will see that picture and then retweet it. So, you know, but there again, Mametz Wood, I guess, is in some respects challenging the norms of the way people see landscape photography. So a lot of people aren't really going to understand it. And I don't think social media is necessarily the best way of actually presenting that. I mean, it's really work that's designed to be seen in a gallery, where you take your time, you see the multiple images, you see it as a series, because there's an element of narrative in there. It's not a very strong narrative, but I think for me, series is very, very important. You know, if a picture says 1,000 words, well, most of them don't say 1,000 words, actually, let's be honest. But, you know, if a picture says a paragraph, then 50 pictures might say 50 paragraphs. But actually, it's the adding them together, where they interact with each other, that actually creates the bigger self.
Social media and photography, you open yourself up for criticism, you open yourself up for all sorts of manner of things. Do you enjoy that process, and what does it give you?
I love thinking about photography, and I think there's plenty of thinking still to be done about photography, and my photography in particular. So actually I find the process of discussing it actually is quite beneficial. You know, it helps me think about what I want to do. It'll help shape my future ideas. I don't know what I was going to say now.
But because you're drawing inspiration from the landscape, and you're drawing inspiration from what poets have written, is that going to be a norm for you in the future, or will you be able to photograph landscape in the way that you want to photograph it, just from your own head, or do you find that inspiration from other people helps?
I probably won't, best not second guess what I might do in the future.
No, indeed not.
Quite frankly, I've no idea. But anyway, I think I really enjoy the process of working with poetry or words or song lyrics or whatever it might be, because it helps me think, and it helps me create images which I may well not have considered otherwise. I think it's actually the choice of it's the choice of words that's actually really quite important to me, though. I mean, there are a billion people writing about landscape or poetry or whatever, but actually I don't really want something that's actually too descriptive about the landscape, because that becomes then just an illustration of the words. It's important for me, well, it's a two-way process between myself as an artist and the words themselves, so that I'm adding value, I suppose.
When you're out in the field, working the landscape, I expect you're working the landscape. Are you working it?
I work really, really slowly.
Right.
I can come here and I can walk from this stream to the top of that valley, and it may have taken me 2 hours. So I'll be circling every tree and looking under every tree stump and looking at the leaves, and it's forcing yourself into a space where you have to see afresh.
Have you been here and not been able to see?
No, I don't think I have. But it sometimes takes a long time to get there. Sometimes, frequently, I'll find the first few images I take are rubbish and just go on the trash pile. But almost getting the camera out and to start exploring with it is important to me. Starting to see it through the frame. Yes. It's something that turns my creative mind on, I suppose.
And would you come here at specific times, or in specific weather conditions?
Generally, I would try and come here in this sort of light, actually, which, for the benefit of people who can't see it listening, is fairly flat. but bright. Actually, then the time of day doesn't matter a great deal. So, yeah, I would probably come here and actually work in the middle of the day. It's a very unconventional thing for landscape photographers to do. But flat, dull, grey light actually works really well in bringing out textures and things in black and white. You don't need, especially with the added contrast to the double exposure, you don't need the sort of strong side light and the shadows, and they can introduce distractions and things you didn't really want to see.
And what equipment do you use?
Just a Canon 5D2 with a 24 to 105 zoom and a 70 to 200 zoom. That allows me the flexibility. I know a lot of people insist that the best way of seeing is to have a fixed lens, but I think for me, getting quite close in was more important than I can see through various focal lengths quite easily, so it doesn't bother me.
Does the box matter?
No, I mean the box is just, nobody makes a bad camera really anymore.
No.
So cameras, digital cameras especially, are white goods. It's
Yes.
not really something that I'm that interested in. It's more important to know how to use the camera, whatever camera it is, than having a special one. Unless you have a very, very specific use for it, or you care very deeply about lack of noise or sharpness or something, which isn't something. Actually, I think one of the inherent problems of digital is actually it's almost too perfect now.
Yes.
And a bit of vignette or a bit of shallow depth of field or
That's
something
quite nice.
adds something to a photograph. It's almost something that is inherently, to my mind, photographic. Henri Cartier-Bresson was out photographing with a 35mm Leica
Yes.
that was built in the 1930s. Okay, it might have had quite a nice lens on it, but actually 35mm film in the 30s was pretty poor stuff compared to what we can do with a digital camera now. But nobody looks at it and goes, "Oh, it's not very sharp, is it?" Or, "Oh, look at the grain in that dark corner. It's not very nice." They see it as an additional element of the image. It's something that adds to it.
Putting your camera on a tripod, it's almost a different world sometimes. I find it.
I think with a tripod, it helps you slow down. If you're hand holding with a camera, you're concentrating on trying to hold it still, or the framing. It allows me to almost step back from it a bit, so I can have a look at it on the back screen, and I can say, if I just moved it around that angle a little bit, then it's going to say what I want it to say more strongly.
Do you use filters at all?
In this project in Mametz Wood, I certainly didn't use filters, although I might use ND grads if necessary. I try to avoid filters, if I'm honest. I think, again, it's adding too much perfection, or the temptation to add too much perfection. And I don't really like perfection. I think perfection's artificial. I think it's stale, it's cold, and it speaks of description. It's saying, how can I make an image which is a perfect representation of what's before me? But I don't want to make a perfect representation of what's before me, because people will see it as a perfect representation of what's before me, rather than seeing it as an image which has a story to tell, or a metaphor within it, or whatever I'm trying to say.
So do you think then, in that respect, that we don't spend enough time looking at images which are of an art nature? I find sometimes that I can stuff that is classified as art, and that leave me cold.
Yeah, so do I. I don't expect every piece of art to have a universal value or universal appreciation. You know, I would expect my work to divide opinion. I almost feel like I would have failed slightly if it didn't. But, you know, concepts are only as good as the concepts.
Yeah. One of my pet hates, Rob, is HDR photography. And it really drives me bonkers. It's this manipulation of landscape that it becomes totally unreal. I don't think... what's your take on that?
I don't like HDR either, as a generality. I mean, there are some very few people who have sort of mastered it, but most people, they've sort of learnt this way of thinking where every highlight has to be perfect and every shadow has to be perfectly resolved, and it doesn't mean anything to me.
But when we're talking about landscape, your Mametz Wood as being landscape photography, is it more about a story than a landscape?
Yes, most definitely. One of the things I think that's important to me is to actually avoid an image that becomes a description of a place.
Yes.
Because that's introducing sort of too much reality, so that the viewer actually won't realise that there's a story behind it, or a metaphor going on within it. So yeah, it's focusing on those little details really, avoiding the big vistas, because if you see a big vista, you see a big vista, and you will probably not think that there is anything beyond it. And that's almost one of the challenges I'm setting myself with my new project, so there you go.
So it's just kind of worlds within worlds, really. It's a world within a landscape. It's another world within a landscape.
Yeah, very much so.
It's all about looking, really. You know, your work on Mametz wouldn't have happened unless you'd spent time, energy, and your eyes looking at the landscape around us here. I mean, I've come here we've been here for about half an hour now, and I find it an inspiring place. The dead wood that's lying around, I can see instantly that there are huge potential. And but it's that exploration, you have to get out there and explore. Did you find this place by accident?
No, I found it through some friends. A friend of mine, Scott, works for, as it was then, Countryside Council for Wales, is Environment Wales now, and part of his job was actually the management of this woodland. And he brought another friend, Sandale Lynch, here, who's a photographer as well. We're all photographers, and they took some photographs here. So I asked where it was, and it was a couple of years later before I actually visited, but it had made an impact. I could see, I mean, they'd photographed the sort of the twists in the trees, which are fantastic, aren't they? I mean,
yes, they are.
They're almost like dancing people.
Yes.
So yeah, it struck a chord. I knew I had to come here.
It must be very different when there are leaves on the tree.
Actually, not that much. These sessile oak trees don't have a very thick canopy. So, and again, working with fairly flat, overcast light, you don't really notice the difference.
Yeah, true. Photography in Wales. We're a disparate lot in Wales. We're all working on as individuals. There's very little photographic community here in Wales. What's your take on that, Rob?
Yeah, we are. It does feel like we're quite sort of atomised, that we're working very much by ourselves. I compare it to my knowledge of what happens in Scotland, where there are groups like Scottish photographers, which develop a really good support mechanism, and they share information, and it helps people get their work out there and known by other photographers, and people, you know, they have connections then with people who run galleries, etc., etc. And I think we need something like that in Wales. But then, you know, it's actually incumbent on the photographers in Wales to get off their asses and actually organise something along that ilk, because it's not going to happen by magic, you know. And I think we would all benefit from it.
Exactly so. So how would you envisage something like that happening?
Well, I think it's got to be relatively organic, really. I think the important thing is that people meet and talk and become friends and share ideas. And because at the end of the day, you know, for me especially, photography is all about ideas, and I love talking to other photographers.
Yes, and to have that sort of professional input as far as being able to show your work to other professional photographers, I think that makes a big difference, because it's altered the way I think about photography, and seeing other people's work does alter the way you think sometimes.
Well, I'm not so sure that I'm bothered whether they're professional photographers or not.
Okay.
But, people who are interested in photography. I mean, I almost think of my landscape work as my amateur work, because I'm not doing it for commercial gain. In fact, I really want to keep commercial ideas out of it, because I can make money as a professional photographer anyway. But with the landscape work, it allows me latitude to do what I want to do. I want it to be seen, but I don't want it to be seen within a commercial context.
So you wouldn't sell your work?
I'd have no objection to anyone giving me money, but it's not my prime motivation.
Okay.
Everywhere you work, it's going to have some element of public funding, but it depends how the power is shared, and that's important. Do you have curators who can actually go out there and find original work and show it because of its value, or does it have to have credibility which appeals to politicians and bureaucrats?
Okay. Do you think there's an element of snobbery about photography in Wales, or just a general lack of interest by the general public?
I think there's, apart from a very few enclaves, there is probably no great thought about photography in Wales at all. I don't think people have any great expectations of it.
And they should?
I think it should be considered on equal footing with other art forms, and certainly other visual art forms.
But that's a continual problem with photography, isn't it? That is it art? And you get, and sometimes I get quite upset actually sometimes by the way that it's dismissed.
Yeah.
And is it because because of this digital age we're living in, we're sort of bombarded by images on a daily basis, and lots of rubbish thrown at us, and that we see, and that we can't see the wood for the trees?
Do you know, I have a sort of slightly different opinion on that. Yes, we are bombarded with imagery, but it also means that a lot of people are more interested in photography than they would have been otherwise. Everybody's now got a camera on their phone, and most people use it, albeit maybe for selfies or whatever, which don't necessarily have a great deal of depth about them. But if people have cameras in their hands, then they have the potential to be interested in photography, and I think it's sort of incumbent on people like me then to say, okay, that's great, let's see where we can take this.
And challenging people, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, important. Yeah. I admire. I wish I had your stamina as far as projects are concerned, because I find little bits of projects or things that I find interesting that I photograph and work with post-wise, and I wish I could follow them through. What is the what makes you follow a project through?
I almost can't not.
Okay.
It's part of photography has become part of who I am. It's become part of explaining to the world something about myself, I suppose. So
can one image make a project?
not for me. It's important, I think, that there's a series of images, because when series come together, they relate to each other and they create a whole which is greater than the individual image.
Mm-hmm.
With Mametz Wood, I had a lot of motifs. So there were circles and there were eyes, and there were stars, and there's a sort of greater interpretation of that if you see them across the whole project, and if you see them, not an interpretation, but a greater level of meaning than if you saw them as individual images.
Okay. Because a painter would do one image.
Yeah.
He may do variations on a theme,
Mm-hmm.
but he would do one image. Or he would come to this wood and draw, and he would draw, but he wouldn't draw them more than once, probably.
I think actually you're probably underestimating painters. From my limited knowledge of painting is that actually they might start with a sketch and then they might work that into a painting.
Yes.
And the painting will change over time, then they will, paint over bits and scrap bits and think about it. And again, I think that's another great aspect of the photographic project, is it actually gives you space and time within which to think how you want to express these things.
Where do you stop?
I generally stop when I run out of words to interpret. To be honest, I was a little bit bereft after finishing Mametz Wood, because I really enjoyed the process. I had to go out then and find something else to go and relate to the landscape. And it always happens, but it's part of my process. And sometimes I will hardly take a photograph for 6 months because I'm thinking, researching, developing ideas.
Is it the natural world that draws you? Does urban photography draw you?
I started off actually as a sort of, in my teens and 20s, I was far more of a street photographer. I always found it a little bit intrusive. Made me feel a bit uncomfortable. I sort of developed strategies for sort of trying to avoid just sort of sticking a camera in somebody's face, but sort of letting them walk into the frame or whatever, that sort of thing. But no, I never felt entirely artistically comfortable with it. But I suppose as I got older, I started to think about the things that are important to me in life. And honestly, I started photographing the landscape actually because I thought it might be quite an interesting thing to do, and I really wasn't very good at it. And I went through a sort of process where I learnt to sort of accept the current norms, and I photographed very much as a conventional landscape photographer for about 5 years. And then started to sort of pull away in my own direction and sort of find ways of expressing myself.
So it's an evolution. Your photography or your personal work is an evolution.
Oh yeah, most definitely. I didn't come out of my mother's womb yesterday as a conceptual landscape photographer. It's just not going to happen. Yeah. And I think, as an artist, you mature as you get older. I was having a discussion with a friend of mine about Dylan Thomas the other day, and saying how young he died, and were we producing good work when we were in our late 30s, or our best work? Well, I know certainly it's not true of me.
So there's more to come.
I don't know, but I hope so. It's very difficult to say.
I can see the stars.
Yeah, you can see the stars.
I can see the stars, Rob.
There they are, all around our feet.
All around our feet.
Yeah.
So what advice would you give to a young photographer, an up-and-coming photographer, an exciting prospect photographer, what advice would you give them?
Follow your own path, I guess. What other people are doing, be aware of it, know about it, know your history of photography, but at the end of the day, absorb all that and spit it out and come up with something of your own. Take your time as well. A number of people, going back to what you were saying earlier about projects, a number of people who work on a project for 6 weeks and think it's done. Well, my projects don't even start for 3 months. That's 9 weeks before I even realise properly what I want to do. And then it's still developing over a year or 18 months or however long it takes.
Yeah. Do you think, it's always struck me that, because I speak both languages, I speak English and Welsh, and I find that, especially in the Welsh-speaking world, that the emphasis on the literary is far greater than on the on pictures or art as such. We haven't developed, and I don't know if that's because we were a very rural society until the Industrial Revolution. I mean, Cardiff was a small village, fishing village. And do you think that's one of the reasons why we don't embrace art as we should, and we're not creating exciting artists and photographers?
I suppose if you look at it historically, I mean, basically the sort of the literary culture of Wales is this sort of spoken language, isn't it? It's this stuff like the Mabinogion that's been handed down over generations, and the stories adapt and change over time. And and I think that has remained a very sort of strong part of the Welsh character. But times change, and I think people are allowed to think of as individuals now, so we can embrace all sorts. And let's not think of Wales as a sort of monocultural place. There are as many people living in Cardiff who are from outside Wales as there are from inside Wales.
Yeah.
There's one doing the sound recording just next to us.
Indeed so. Yes. Yeah. It's really difficult with education. I find it kind of hard. You can't teach people how to look. You can teach them how the box works.
Well, at the end of the day, I imagine if you spoke to people who were buying photography from the commercial sector, they would actually be looking for people who are able to see and create creatively. Because there are 100,000 photographers in Britain who can follow the norms, who can easily, with modern technology, make an accurate exposure of something that you've seen before. But what you want is the fresh image, the image that says something new.
Yes.
Something that will stand out from the crowd.
Crowd, yes.
Yeah. If you're in an advertising agency,
you've got to stand out from the crowd.
You need to stand out from the crowd. Albeit within probably, within some norms which are about selling things.
Yes.
So it's, I mean, I think I learnt a lot about developing my concepts and my ideas from my personal landscape photography from working as a commercial photographer. Because you get a brief. I want A, B, C and D. We'll have a little chat about D, because that's a bit vague. And can you see what you can get? And you have to go away and think about it, or look at it. And how am I going to interpret that?
What I find, sometimes you don't even get the opportunity to think about it.
No, yeah.
I mean, you find yourself in situations where you have to make the best of what you've got. And
frequently.
and that is that's a really difficult, because you really have to think on your feet and be able to turn out the goods, because time is another element on commercial photography that is, I find, excruciatingly difficult sometimes.
Yeah.
When
Yeah.
you are given literally 10 minutes or even less. I mean, I was in a situation yesterday where I was given, people turned up late, which meant I had less time, and I had to photograph, and the situation was wrong.
The number of times when I used to work as a photographer for the University of Glamorgan, and the number of times I had 5 minutes to make a portrait, I forget, it just happened all the time. Yeah, people would turn up late, they would think it takes a 30th of a second to take a photograph, and that's all there is to it.
Yes.
But of course there's not.
No.
And if you want a good image, it's going to take a lot longer than that.
Yes, yes.
But, then they were busy people, and they had other priorities, and, it was probably just a mugshot for the website.
So inspirations are important, and people who have inspired you. Who are the people who have inspired you? What photographers have inspired you?
I'm fascinated by photography. There are a lot of people who inspire me. I think Chris Tancock was probably quite mind-opening for me, the way he thinks about photography. And certainly, if you want another example of somebody who makes very long-term projects, he's a great one. He did a series which he spent 5 years over, photographing 5 fields. And the images are fantastic.
Mike Jackson is on Twitter. He springs to mind.
Yeah, I like Mike's work.
Yes,
I love the fact with Mike's work that actually it's really quite different to mine. The sort of the idea element. It's not idea driven, but it's almost become a concept over time. It's sort of changed over time as well, because his sort of first idea was with Poppet Sands was that. It looked like the moon, and it reminded him of sort of his sort of childhood aspirations, I suppose, to visit the moon or see the moon or whatever. But it's taken on a whole sort of life of its own. And that's again a very long-term project. He's been doing that 6 or 7 years now,
yes. And all on film.
Yeah, I think he actually started originally on digital, but he's moved to film latterly. But he's saying he's going to carry on doing that for the rest of his life, because there is so much change there. Anyway, it's fantastic. He's discovered, he's on a beach, and every time the tide comes in and out, there's something new, and that's just wonderful, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes. To have the luxury to be able to do that sort of thing as well.
Yeah, and I'm a little bit jealous, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
But my photography comes from a slightly different place to that. But yeah, I'm always looking at photography and pondering photography. I look at far too much photography sometimes, and it starts to lose any relevance and depth. Sometimes you can overdo it. I'm always a fan of the idea that if you go to a gallery, you just look at one painting and actually try and work it out. Relate to it.
Have you ever thought about using audio with your Mametz Wood, to actually have audio with it?
No. I don't know how that would work in terms of presenting it within a gallery.
Right. Well, whether it could be.
Well, I suppose you could get an actor to read it and give people headphones. Yeah.
Yeah, although
it's a possibility.
It's a possibility, isn't it?
Yeah.
Do you think we should be it's something we should experiment with as?
I think everybody working in any form of art should be experimenting constantly.
Yeah.
It's the lifeblood of what we do.
Yeah.
99% of experiments end up in the trash can, but that's fine.
Yeah, but you need the opportunity to be able to do that. And what I'm thinking in Wales, what happens in Wales is we're not given the opportunity, or artists are not given the opportunity to do that, to experiment, because we're funding and all this nonsense that goes on around art in Wales. And so you're not getting these experiments, or you're getting them on a very small scale, done by students maybe, which is fine. I have no problem with that whatsoever. But practitioners such as yourself, who's doing important work, which is a lot of thought and a lot of thinking behind it, are not given that opportunity, and I find that is a sin.
yeah, I mean, I'd certainly like there to be more opportunities within Wales to exhibit. I mean, it's not to say that it won't get exhibited in Wales. I'm pretty sure it will somewhere or other. There are some certain possibilities I'm currently pursuing.
Yeah.
But you know, at the end of the day, it has to be down to the photographer.
Yes.
You've got to actually buckle down and do the work.
Yes, I know.
And you know, it's no good complaining that the galleries aren't showing interesting work if people aren't creating interesting work to put in the galleries. So it has to come from within. It has to be something that you have to do. It has to be part of you.
I'm working on a project at the moment, and I've kind of hit a dilemma with it, because the dilemma is that I have a building, and I can photograph the building, and I can photograph its crumbling nature of this building, and it's fading away. But I was looking at the work the other night, and I was pondering. I was about, I don't know, 35, 36 shots. And I was looking at these shots, and there's an emptiness about them. And because there is no human interaction happening in those pictures, there are no human beings in the pictures, because they weren't allowed to be in the pictures. So all I have is this shell. And the shell... And I find that really, really frustrating, because because you were talking about human interaction with this Mametz Wood. It's about you and the landscape, with the added story behind the battle that happened in France.
Yeah.
But
you will find human elements within an abandoned building. There'll be.
Oh yes, there's graffiti, and I can relate to that graffiti.
There'll be a broken chair or a smashed window or something, and you can say things with those.
Yes, you can. But yes, you can. Yes, you can. But there's still that emptiness there, which I find it's almost like it's a ghost of a place. Yeah. And
so explore the emptiness.
Maybe that's a good idea. And the emptiness, I mean, I can't escape it. It's there. It's. But if we had, this is great to see, because if we had I can't think of the English word. If we had photographers working together, or speaking, or being able to meet as groups of photographers in Wales, which doesn't happen, then these ideas, you can bounce ideas off other people. Yeah. Because what tends to happen is, as a photographer, because you're on your lonesome and you're with your computer and you're with your camera, you know, you don't have anybody else with you at all. And unless you can bounce these ideas around, ideas die, I think, unless you're very, very focused. That's why I admire your ability to focus, because I find that really difficult.
Yeah, but ideas really have to come from within. It's almost like following a process, really. It's following a path.
Yeah.
Yes, you can bounce ideas, and you might be able to jump a few steps.
Yes.
But at the end of the day, you still actually have to be producing work which is following a route which only you will actually ever know.
Yes. Yes.
Which sounds horribly mystical and bollocksy, but actually there's some truth in it, you know?
Yeah, there is some truth in it. The project I'm referring to is the project on Whitchurch Hospital.
Yeah.
And a book was produced with people's reflections and their poems and their writings about the time they'd spent at Whitchurch. And I did the photography before I read the work, but the work now has an influence on the way I look at the place. Yeah. And it's trying to dovetail all those ideas and putting them into a place that is coherent and that makes sense to the viewer. Because as pictures, they're quite. Yeah, I'm quite proud of some of them. They're really nice pictures, but they don't really say anything about that. They kind of say something over this. I don't know. Yeah. And this is where the interaction with other photographers is important, and showing work to other photographers.
Well, there's a lot of people that go and photograph empty mental hospitals.
Yes.
And they tend to sort of end up photographing the cliches. It becomes a bit trite, So the smashed window becomes a metaphor for the broken mind, or
yes.
The dirty bathtub becomes sort of metaphor for the suffering of the inmate, but actually, of course, there's a much more rounded story there.
Yes.
A lot of people, you know, may have gone in there with severe problems, but actually, a lot of people may have come out of there with some good treatment and, and have, you know, better lives for it.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
You know, and it's thinking around these things. It's important.
Mm.